One wrong decision kills 12 careers before they even begin. The words echoed across the training hall and erased every whisper in the room. More than 80 recruits sat frozen in their seats as Colonel Richard Hayes stood at the front of the auditorium, one hand resting on a digital map projected across a massive screen. The training hall at Fort Jefferson was usually loud. Boots scraped against polished floors. Chairs shifted. Recruits traded quiet jokes when instructors looked away. But not this morning. Not after the colonel's challenge. The map behind him displayed a complicated training scenario. Multiple routes. Limited resources. Strict time constraints. It looked simple at first glance, but every recruit in the room already knew the truth. 3 squad leaders had attempted to solve it. All 3 had failed. "You've had 20 minutes, Colonel Hayes said. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that demanded attention. And so far, every answer I've heard creates new problems instead of solving the original one. Nobody spoke. A few recruits stared at their notebooks. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Near the center of the room, Tyler Brooks leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. 23 years old, confident, athletic, and always eager to be the loudest voice in any room. Tyler had entered the academy convinced he was destined for leadership. 10 minutes earlier, he had confidently presented his solution. 5 minutes later, the colonel had dismantled every part of it. The silence stretched. Colonel Hayes looked across the room. No volunteers. Still nothing. The challenge remained unanswered. In the last row sat Emma Parker. Most people barely noticed her. Her uniform looked no different from anyone else's. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a regulation bun. A worn notebook rested on her lap, its corners bent from years of use. She wasn't talking. She wasn't trying to attract attention. She simply watched. For weeks, Emma had become almost invisible inside the academy. She arrived early. She left late. She completed every assignment without complaint. While other recruits competed for recognition, she stayed quiet. Some interpreted her silence as nervousness. Others assumed she lacked confidence. A few simply forgot she was there at all. That assumption suited Emma just fine. Across the room, several recruits exchanged nervous glances. The challenge remained unsolved. Colonel Hayes folded his arms. "Interesting," he said. 80 future leaders. Not one willing to make a decision. The comment landed harder than anyone expected. Several faces turned red. Tyler looked irritated. The colonel wasn't just questioning their answers anymore. He was questioning their courage. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows of the training facility. Inside, the tension felt heavier with every passing second. Then something unexpected happened. Colonel Hayes slowly scanned the room one final time. His eyes moved past the front rows, past the squad leaders, past the top-ranked recruits, until they stopped on someone sitting quietly in the very back. Emma Parker looked up. For the first time that morning, the colonel seemed interested. "You," he said. The recruit in the last row. Every head in the hall turned at once. "Do you see something everyone else missed?" For a moment, Emma thought she might have misheard him. The entire training hall seemed to narrow into a single point as dozens of eyes locked onto her from every direction. She could feel the weight of their attention, but her expression never changed. Around her, recruits shifted in their seats, some curious, others amused. Tyler Brooks smirked openly. He leaned toward the recruit beside him and whispered something that drew a few quiet laughs. Colonel Hayes noticed the reaction but said nothing. His focus remained fixed on Emma. "Well," he asked, "do you?" Emma glanced at the map projected on the screen. The same map every recruit had been studying for the last 20 minutes. The same scenario that had frustrated the strongest candidates in the room. She lowered her eyes briefly to the notebook resting in her lap. Then she closed it. "Maybe, sir," she said. Her voice was calm and surprisingly steady. A few eyebrows rose around the room. Nobody expected confidence from the quiet recruit in the back row. Tyler chuckled. "This should be interesting." Several recruits laughed with him. Emma heard them. She simply ignored them. Colonel Hayes nodded once. "Stand up." Emma rose from her chair. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, she did not appear intimidating. She looked like any other recruit in the academy. That was part of the reason people overlooked her. There were no medals on display, no dramatic stories, no constant attempts to impress instructors. She never volunteered to lead group discussions. She never fought for attention. While others competed to be noticed, Emma focused on listening. The colonel studied her for a moment. Before you answer, he said, tell me something. Why have you stayed silent all morning? The question surprised everyone. Emma thought for a second. Because nobody asked me, sir. A few scattered laughs appeared throughout the hall. Even Colonel Hayes allowed the faintest hint of a smile. Tyler rolled his eyes. Convenient answer. Emma did not look at him. The colonel stepped away from the podium and folded his arms. Fair enough, he said. Then let me ask now. What do you see? Emma looked back at the map. The room became quiet again. Outside, the wind continued tapping against the windows. Somewhere near the front row, a chair creaked. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Emma studied the routes displayed across the screen. The supply points. The timing restrictions. The transportation schedules. Most recruits saw a leadership problem. Most saw logistics. Most saw a test. Emma saw something else entirely. Something that had bothered her from the moment the scenario appeared. She slowly lifted her gaze toward the colonel. Sir, she said carefully, I think everyone has been trying to solve the wrong problem. The words landed like a stone in still water. Several recruits exchanged confused looks. Tyler's smile faded slightly. Colonel Hayes remained completely still. Explain, he said. Emma took a slow breath. For the first time all morning, the entire hall was listening. Emma kept her eyes on the map. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply answering the question the colonel had asked. The room remained silent as she stepped away from her chair and looked toward the large screen at the front of the hall. Everyone has been focused on moving resources from point Alpha to point Delta, she said. That is why every solution keeps creating new delays. Tyler folded his arms. That is the assignment. Several recruits nodded in agreement. Emma glanced at him briefly. That is what the assignment looks like. A few confused expressions appeared throughout the room. Colonel Hayes said nothing. He wanted her to continue. Emma pointed toward one corner of the projected map. The schedule shows transportation limitations between 6 and 8 in the morning. Every proposed solution assumes those limitations are fixed. She paused. But nowhere does the scenario actually say they are fixed. The room grew quieter. Several recruits immediately looked back at their notes. Tyler frowned. Emma continued. If those restrictions are adjustable, then the transportation route becomes the solution instead of the obstacle. A captain seated near the front straightened in his chair. The colonel slowly turned toward the screen. Emma's voice remained steady. Everyone has been trying to work around the bottleneck. Nobody asked whether the bottleneck needed to exist at all. For the first time all morning, nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Recruits flipped through notebooks, searching for the exact wording of the scenario. The answer was there, hidden in plain sight. Colonel Hayes looked at the projected briefing and then back at Emma. Go on. Emma nodded. If the transportation schedule changes by 30 minutes, every supply movement arrives early. The staffing shortage disappears. The training conflict disappears. The deadline is met without requiring additional resources. A murmur spread through the hall. Several recruits were already realizing she was right. Tyler looked down at his own notes. His confidence was beginning to crack. The solution sounded simple now. Too simple, which made it even more frustrating. They had all missed it. Colonel Hayes walked slowly across the stage. Interesting. He studied the map again. Very interesting. Emma returned her attention to the screen. She was not smiling. She was not celebrating. To her, it was simply a problem that needed solving. Nothing more. The colonel turned toward the audience. How many of you reviewed the transportation assumptions? Not a single hand went up. The answer spoke for itself. Several recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emma remained standing in the back row. The same recruit nobody had noticed an hour earlier. The same recruit many had quietly dismissed during the first weeks of training. Yet now every eye in the room was focused on her. Tyler stared forward, saying nothing. Colonel Hayes looked directly at Emma once more. There was a new expression in his eyes now. Not surprise. Not curiosity. Recognition. As if something about her answer reminded him of a detail he had seen before. A detail buried somewhere in a file he had not thought about in months. The training hall remained silent long after Emma finished speaking. Colonel Hayes walked back toward the podium, but his attention was no longer on the map. It was on her. The recruits noticed it immediately. In military training, attention from a senior officer was never random. Every movement meant something. Every question had a purpose. Tyler Brooks shifted in his seat. He had spent weeks building a reputation as one of the Academy's strongest voices. Now that confidence felt less secure. The quiet recruit from the last row had just solved a problem that had defeated nearly everyone in the room. Worse, she had done it without showing the slightest interest in proving anyone wrong. Colonel Hayes picked up a folder resting on the podium. He opened it slowly, scanning several pages. His expression did not change, but Emma noticed the subtle pause. The colonel had found something. Several instructors seated along the side wall exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward slightly. Another looked toward Emma with renewed curiosity. The atmosphere inside the hall had shifted. The challenge was over, yet nobody seemed ready to move on. Colonel Hayes finally closed the folder. "Emma Parker," he said. "How long have you been here?" 6 weeks, sir." "And before this academy?" Emma hesitated. "Various training programs, sir." A few recruits quietly laughed. The answer sounded vague. Tyler smirked again. That could mean anything. Emma did not react. Colonel Hayes continued studying her. "Various training programs," he repeated. Interesting choice of words. He stepped away from the podium and looked toward the audience. "Tell me something. How many of you know the person sitting next to you?" Several hands rose. "How many of you know the background of every recruit in this room?" The hands disappeared. The colonel nodded. "Exactly." He looked back at Emma. "People make assumptions. They see someone quiet and decide they understand the entire story." The room became uncomfortable again. Everyone knew he was no longer talking about the scenario on the screen. He was talking about them, about the way they had treated people they barely knew. Tyler stared forward without speaking. Colonel Hayes turned toward the instructors seated near the wall. "Instructor Miller," he said, "would you bring me Recruit Parker's evaluation file?" The request surprised everyone. Even Emma looked slightly confused. Instructor Miller stood immediately and crossed the room. Within moments, a thin folder appeared in the colonel's hands. He opened it carefully. The hall remained silent. Recruits watched as his eyes moved across the pages. Then something changed. His posture straightened. The room did not miss it. Whatever he had found was important. Very important. The colonel looked up slowly. His gaze settled on Emma once more. This time there was no curiosity left in his expression, only recognition, as if a missing piece had suddenly fallen into place. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains a great deal." No one knew what he meant. Not the instructors, not the recruits, not even Tyler Brooks. But every person in the training hall felt the same thing at that moment. The story they thought they understood about Emma Parker was only beginning. No one spoke after Colonel Hayes closed the file. The training hall felt different now. The challenge that had dominated the morning was no longer the center of attention. Every recruit in the room was watching the exchange between the colonel and the quiet woman standing in the last row. Tyler Brooks finally broke the silence. "Sir, with all due respect, what exactly is in that file?" Several heads turned toward him. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Colonel Hayes looked at Tyler for a moment before returning his attention to Emma. "Nothing classified," he said. "Nothing dramatic." The answer only increased the curiosity in the room. The colonel tapped the folder lightly against his palm. "What I found was a recommendation letter." Emma's expression remained unchanged. A recommendation letter that arrived 6 months ago from a leadership development program. A murmur spread through the hall. Leadership programs were competitive. Hundreds applied. Very few were selected. "The interesting part," Colonel Hayes continued, "is who wrote it." He opened the file once more. Brigadier General Thomas Walker. The room immediately became quiet again. Even recruits with little military experience recognized the name. General Walker was known throughout the training community. His endorsements carried weight. Serious weight. Tyler blinked. A general wrote her recommendation? Yes. The colonel's voice remained calm. And according to this letter, Recruit Parker was invited into a pilot leadership assessment program 2 years earlier. Several instructors exchanged surprised looks. Emma lowered her eyes briefly. She clearly did not enjoy being the focus of attention. Colonel Hayes continued reading. The letter describes her as unusually disciplined, exceptionally observant, and capable of identifying solutions that others overlook. He closed the folder. That sounds familiar. A few recruits shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The description matched exactly what they had witnessed during the scenario exercise. Tyler stared at Emma. For the first time since the morning began, he seemed unsure what to say. The assumptions he had built over the last 6 weeks were beginning to fall apart. Emma had never talked about leadership programs. She had never mentioned recommendations from generals. She had never used any of it to gain status among the recruits. She simply showed up every day and did the work. Colonel Hayes stepped toward the center of the stage. Do you know why most people missed her answer? Nobody responded. Because they were too busy defending their own solutions. The words landed hard. Leadership is not about being the loudest person in the room. It is about seeing what everyone else ignores. His gaze swept across the audience. Some of you walked into this academy believing confidence and competence were the same thing. They are not. The hall remained silent. Emma stood exactly where she had been from the beginning. Calm, uncomfortable with the attention, uninterested in proving herself right. Then Colonel Hayes looked at her again. Recruit Parker. Yes, sir. There is something else in this file. For the first time, a hint of surprise appeared in Emma's eyes. The colonel studied her carefully. Something that explains why General Walker remembered your name after all these years. Emma looked genuinely caught off guard for the first time that morning. Not frightened, not nervous, simply surprised. Around the room, every recruit leaned forward slightly. The training hall had become completely silent. Even the instructors seemed interested in what Colonel Hayes was about to reveal. The colonel opened the folder again and scanned a single page. 2 years ago, he said, General Walker hosted a national leadership assessment involving candidates from military preparatory programs, universities, and service academies. Several recruits exchanged glances. They knew the event by reputation. Selection standards were demanding. Participation alone was considered an achievement. Colonel Hayes continued. The final exercise involved a complex planning scenario. Hundreds of candidates entered. Only a handful identified the central flaw hidden inside the problem. He paused. Recruit Parker was one of them. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Tyler Brooks stared at Emma. The comparison felt impossible. The quiet woman who spent lunch reading alone had apparently been competing in programs most recruits could only dream about entering. According to General Walker, the colonel said, lifting the page slightly, she was the youngest participant to recognize the error. The room fell silent again. Emma lowered her gaze. She clearly wished the conversation would end. But Colonel Hayes was not finished. What impressed him was not the answer itself. The colonel closed the file. It was what happened afterward. Now even Emma looked curious. When the exercise ended, participants were asked to explain why they succeeded. He glanced toward her. Most spoke about intelligence, preparation, natural ability. The colonel tapped the folder lightly. You wrote that success came from listening longer than everyone else. Several recruits looked down. The words carried more weight now than they would have an hour earlier. Emma remembered the exercise immediately. She had been 19 years old, nervous, surrounded by people who seemed smarter and more experienced. The memory felt distant now. I had forgotten about that, she admitted quietly. Colonel Hayes nodded. General Walker did not. He turned toward the audience. You want to know why some people advance faster than others? Nobody answered. Because they never stop learning. They never assume they already know enough. His eyes moved across the room. Many of you spent weeks measuring yourselves against each other, comparing scores, competing for attention. Meanwhile, the recruit sitting in the last row focused on understanding instead of impressing. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The description hit close to home. The colonel was not calling anyone out directly, yet everyone understood the lesson. Emma had never asked for recognition. She had never mentioned recommendation letters, leadership programs, or senior officers who remembered her name. She had simply done the work. Colonel Hayes walked toward the center aisle. There is one final note attached to this file. The room grew quiet once more. A note written by General Walker himself. He looked directly at Emma before reading a single sentence. Watch this candidate carefully. She has a habit of changing the direction of a room without ever trying to become the center of it. The words hung in the air. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. For the first time since training began, the recruits were not looking at Emma Parker as the quiet woman in the back row. They were seeing someone they had completely misunderstood. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Colonel Hayes had said all morning. Recruits who had barely noticed Emma during the first 6 weeks of training were now replaying every interaction they had ever had with her. Some remembered passing her in the hall without a second glance. Others remembered group exercises where she spoke only when necessary. Suddenly those moments seemed different. Tyler Brooks stared at the floor for several seconds before finally looking toward Emma again. He expected confidence. He expected someone enjoying the attention. Instead, she looked uncomfortable standing there while her accomplishments were discussed. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people chased recognition. Emma seemed to avoid it. Colonel Hayes placed the file on the podium and slowly crossed his arms. "There is a reason I wanted all of you to hear this," he said. "Not because Recruit Parker is special." The statement surprised the room. She is not special because of a recommendation letter. She is not special because a general remembered her name. She is not special because she solved a scenario. He paused. She is special because she never assumed she was the smartest person in the room. Several recruits lowered their eyes. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. The colonel walked toward the projection screen and pointed at the map that had started the entire discussion. This exercise was never about logistics. Confused expressions appeared across the audience. It was about ego. Nobody spoke. Every failed solution came from the same mistake. People became attached to being right. His gaze moved across the hall. When that happens, learning stops. Emma remained silent. She knew the colonel was no longer speaking about a training scenario. He was speaking about leadership itself. Instructor Miller nodded quietly from the side of the room. Even the instructors seemed to be listening more carefully now. Tyler finally raised his hand. The movement surprised several recruits. He was not known for admitting mistakes. "Sir." Colonel Hayes looked at him. "Go ahead." Tyler hesitated. If she had all this experience, why did she never tell anyone? The question hung in the air. Several recruits immediately wondered the same thing. Colonel Hayes glanced toward Emma. "Perhaps we should ask her." Every eye in the room turned toward her once again. Emma thought for a moment. Because nobody needed to know. The answer was simple, honest, completely unexpected. Tyler frowned. "You never thought it would help?" Emma shook her head. If people only listen because of something written in a file, then they are listening for the wrong reason. The room became silent again. Several recruits exchanged thoughtful looks. The answer landed harder than any speech could have. Colonel Hayes smiled slightly. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that morning. "That," he said, "is exactly why General Walker remembered her." Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The assumptions that had defined Emma Parker for weeks were gone now. In their place stood something much stronger than reputation. Respect. Not because a senior officer had demanded it. Not because a file said she deserved it. But because every person in that hall had just witnessed the difference between seeking attention and earning trust. The atmosphere inside the training hall continued to shift long after the conversation should have ended. Colonel Hayes glanced at the clock mounted on the far wall. Nearly an hour had passed since the exercise began, yet nobody seemed interested in leaving. The recruits were still processing what they had witnessed. Emma Parker had not changed. She stood in the same place. She wore the same uniform. She spoke with the same quiet voice. Yet somehow everything felt different. Instructor Miller approached the podium carrying a stack of evaluation sheets. Normally, this signaled the end of a training session. Today, however, even he seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. Colonel Hayes looked across the room one final time. "Before we continue," he said, "I want everyone here to do something." The recruits immediately straightened in their seats. Think about the first impression you had of the person sitting closest to you. Confused expressions appeared throughout the hall. Then ask yourself how much of that impression was based on facts. Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. Tyler Brooks leaned back slowly. His mind returned to the first day of training. He remembered seeing Emma arrive carrying a worn notebook and an old duffel bag. He remembered assuming she would struggle. He remembered deciding she lacked confidence because she rarely spoke. None of those assumptions had come from evidence. They came from appearances. Across the room, other recruits were having similar realizations. Colonel Hayes nodded. Good leaders gather information before forming conclusions. He paused. Poor leaders do the opposite. The lesson landed with remarkable force because nobody felt personally attacked. Instead, they felt challenged. Emma finally sat back down in her seat. For the first time all morning, several recruits turned toward her with genuine curiosity instead of judgment. One recruit near the front raised a hand. "Sir." "Go ahead. If Recruit Parker already had opportunities before coming here, why start over in this program?" The question echoed through the room. Several heads nodded. They wanted to know the answer too. Emma looked toward the floor briefly before responding. Because experience is not the same as growth. The simplicity of the statement caught everyone off guard. She continued, I wanted to learn from people who see things differently than I do. Nobody expected that answer. It would have been easy to talk about achievements, easy to discuss recommendations and special programs. Instead, she spoke about learning. Colonel Hayes smiled again. That answer tells me more than any file ever could. Several recruits nodded quietly. Even Tyler found himself agreeing. The confidence he had displayed for weeks suddenly felt shallow compared to the quiet certainty Emma carried without ever talking about it. The colonel gathered the folder from the podium and closed it. This academy exists for one reason, he said. To develop leaders capable of improving the people around them. His gaze moved across the room. Today, one recruit accomplished that without rank, authority, or recognition. Nobody looked away. For the first time since training began, the room understood that leadership had been sitting in the last row all along. They simply had not recognized it when they saw it. The training session finally came to an end, but nobody rushed for the exits. Normally, the moment Colonel Hayes dismissed a class, the room filled with movement and conversation. Today was different. Recruits remained seated for a few extra moments, quietly reflecting on everything they had heard. The map on the screen no longer mattered. The scenario no longer mattered. What remained was a lesson far larger than any exercise. Colonel Hayes gathered his materials and looked across the hall one last time. Before you leave, he said, remember something. The room immediately grew quiet again. The people who change organizations are rarely the people demanding attention. More often, they are the people paying attention. His words settled over the audience. You will spend your careers meeting individuals who look ordinary. Some will speak less than others. Some will never tell you what they have accomplished. Some will never ask for recognition. He paused. Do not mistake humility for weakness. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Colonel Hayes glanced briefly toward Emma Parker. The easiest thing in the world is to underestimate someone. His gaze returned to the room. The harder thing is keeping your mind open long enough to discover who they really are. Several recruits nodded quietly. Tyler Brooks sat motionless. The morning had changed him more than he expected. Weeks earlier, he had judged Emma before learning anything about her. He had assumed confidence meant speaking first. He had assumed leadership meant being noticed. Now he understood how incomplete that view had been. As recruits slowly began gathering their notebooks, Tyler stood and walked toward the last row. Several people noticed immediately. Emma was placing her worn notebook into her bag when he stopped beside her chair. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Tyler extended his hand. I owe you an apology. Emma looked surprised. For what? Tyler gave a small laugh. For thinking I had you figured out. Emma considered that for a moment before shaking his hand. You were not the only one. The response drew a few smiles from nearby recruits. The tension that had existed for weeks seemed to disappear in an instant. There was no bitterness in her voice. No need to prove a point. Only quiet honesty. As the room gradually emptied, Colonel Hayes watched from the front of the hall. Instructor Miller stepped beside him. Interesting group this year, Miller said. The colonel nodded. Very. His eyes followed Emma as she slung her bag over her shoulder and headed toward the exit. She was not surrounded by attention. She was not celebrating. She was simply moving on to the next part of her day. You knew she was capable, Miller said. I suspected, Hayes replied. But today was never about proving what she could do. Then what was it about? The colonel smiled faintly, showing everyone else what they were missing. Emma stepped through the doors and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. Behind her, the training hall felt different than it had that morning. Not because one recruit had solved a problem. Not because a file had revealed an impressive history. It felt different because an entire room had learned the same lesson at the same time. Respect is not earned by speaking the loudest. It is earned by character, humility, and the quiet confidence to let actions speak long before words ever do.